84 letters, 3 days. I've reported you to Homeland Security. That's how my new neighbor welcomed me, standing dead center in my front yard, holding a clipboard, Bluetooth earpiece in one ear, and live streaming my mailbox like it was a national security threat. I had just moved into Willow Glen, supposedly the most peaceful neighborhood in the state, with community gardens, neighborhood watches, and, apparently, a homeowners association that functions like a miniature surveillance state. I work in cybersecurity. I've spent years building systems that detect fraudulent email traffic. Never did I imagine I'd be accused of running a mail-based crime syndicate by a woman who wears a self-made compliance briefings on Facebook Live. I thought I was moving in for peace. Instead, I walked into a war over envelopes. And if you think that sounds insane, you haven't seen what came next. I moved to a neighborhood that everyone said was absolutely peaceful. But you know what? Here, if your mailbox is full for more than 2 days, you might be considered a criminal. I thought this stuff only happened in movies, until a neighbor started recording how many pieces of mail I received every morning. At first, I thought she was just curious, but that curiosity quickly turned into something I could never have imagined. And from someone who just wanted peace and quiet, I was forced to fight back. Have you ever been bothered by an HOA just for living a little differently? If so, listen to my story. And if not, stick around until the end to decide for yourself. Comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I'm genuinely curious if anyone else has dealt with HOA drama like this. I moved to Meadowbrook Heights because everyone said it was peaceful, but I knew I was wrong when I saw a woman standing in front of my mailbox, clipboard in hand, counting every single piece of mail. Day 3 in a row. Total count 76 pieces uncollected. Notes. Suspected criminal activity or fraudulent residency. She turned to look at me with eyes like bullets. What's your name and why do you get so much mail? I could only respond, guess I need a secretary more than a lawyer. My name is Miles Dalton, and I used to program systems that track data breaches. Now I'm being tracked by someone who loves rule books. I work in cybersecurity, analyzing threats for my home office, which means I get a lot of professional mail. Government security reports, vendor catalogs, client documentation, the kind of stuff that keeps organizations safe from hackers. In the city, nobody cared if you got 50 pieces of mail a day, but apparently in Meadowbrook Heights, receiving more than 3 pieces per day makes you a suspected criminal mastermind. The woman with the clipboard was Brooke Ellison, and she lived 2 houses down like some kind of suburban surveillance operation. She wasn't just casually curious, she had systems, a digital counter that clicked every time mail went into my box, a laminated chart showing what she called normal residential mail patterns, with my address highlighted in bright red as exceeding acceptable limits. When she approached me that Tuesday morning, she was wearing a Bluetooth headset and muttering numbers under her breath like she was reporting to some kind of mail monitoring headquarters. "I'm Brooke Ellison from the HOA committee," she announced, extending her hand while still holding that counter device. "I've been conducting community security assessments, and your address is showing concerning statistical anomalies." She clicked her counter again and made a note. 17 pieces yesterday, 14 the day before, 19 last Friday. Most residents average 3 to 4 pieces daily, but you're consistently in what we classify as the commercial activity zone. The way she said "we" made it sound like she had an entire team of mail surveillance specialists backing her up. I explained that I work in cybersecurity, that I analyze security reports and threat intelligence, and that much of my correspondence comes through traditional mail for security reasons. Some government contracts require physical documentation for sensitive information. But instead of understanding, Brooke pulled out what looked like a professional investigation folder and started asking for my client list, income verification, and detailed business operations documentation. "The HOA needs to verify you're not running unauthorized commercial operations," she said, making aggressive notes. "We've researched mail fraud patterns in suburban communities, and your volume matches several red flag indicators." Being in cybersecurity, you learn to recognize social engineering, when someone probes for sensitive information through seemingly official questioning. Brooke's interrogation felt exactly like that, except instead of trying to hack a computer system, she was trying to find any excuse to validate her suspicions about my perfectly legal business activities. I kept my responses polite but vague, explaining that client confidentiality prevented sharing specific details. This clearly frustrated her, and she made several pointed notes before promising that ongoing monitoring would continue until she could verify my activities were legitimate. That's when I noticed she had a measuring tape and what appeared to be a professional camera with a telephoto lens. She'd been documenting the distance from my mailbox to my front door, photographing package dimensions, and creating what looked like a comprehensive surveillance file on my daily routine. I have every right to photograph anything visible from public property, she explained when I asked what she was doing. Community safety requires thorough documentation of potential zoning violations and suspicious delivery patterns. The most disturbing part was discovering that she'd been going door to door with official-looking forms, asking neighbors to report observations about my business activities and whether they'd noticed unusual foot traffic or delivery schedules at my address. She'd created what she called a neighborhood security assessment, with checkboxes for different types of suspicious activity, essentially recruiting other residents to participate in surveilling my perfectly normal work-from-home lifestyle. By the end of that first week, I realized that installing security cameras hadn't been paranoid professional habit. It was going to be essential for documenting what was clearly becoming a systematic harassment campaign. Brooke Ellison wasn't just a nosy neighbor with boundary issues. She was someone with an obsessive need to control her environment who had decided that my business correspondence represented some kind of threat to community security that needed to be investigated, documented, and ultimately eliminated through whatever means necessary. That evening, I upgraded my entire security system and began keeping detailed digital logs of every interaction with neighbors. Standard practice when you're dealing with what cybersecurity professionals call a persistent threat actor. I told myself this was probably just an isolated incident with an overly zealous HOA member, but deep down, I knew this was only the beginning of something much more complicated and potentially dangerous. I had no idea that her clipboard surveillance was just the opening move in what would become a neighborhood war that would eventually involve law enforcement, public hearings, and viral social media drama that would change our community forever. The next morning, I saw a small LED display board erected in Brooke's front yard. Mail count for address 14B today, 19, status, under investigation. It was like something you'd see at a sports stadium, except instead of showing scores, it was broadcasting my personal mail statistics to the entire neighborhood. Kevin Marshall, an older neighbor who lived next to Brooke, walked over and whispered to me. She calls it Project HOA Eyes. Already installed cameras at gate number 3, too. I realized I wasn't just dealing with a nosy neighbor anymore. This was someone who had turned harassment into a semi-professional operation. Within days, Brooke had transformed from annoying clipboard lady into what could only be described as the commander of a suburban surveillance network. She'd recruited Kevin Marshall, who worked in insurance and had that naturally suspicious personality that made him receptive to theories about neighborhood fraud schemes. Together, they'd established scheduled observation periods, coordinated photography sessions, and detailed documentation procedures that would have impressed actual law enforcement agencies. But the LED scoreboard was just the beginning. Brooke had also started conducting live broadcasts during mail delivery times. Yes, you heard that right. Brooke was literally live streaming my mail delivery routine to the neighborhood social media group, providing running commentary like she was narrating a nature documentary about suspicious suburban behavior. Day 12 of monitoring the anomalous mail volume situation at address 14B, she announced to her phone camera while positioned strategically near the mailbox. The subject continues receiving excessive commercial correspondence with no apparent legitimate business explanation. Today's preliminary count is already 11 pieces and it's only 10:15 a.m. Jessica Torres, the single mother who lived across the street, was dealing with her own Brooke harassment campaign. She pulled her daughter's bicycle into the garage and whispered to me, "She once called the police because my kid was blowing a whistle at 5 p.m. Don't expect peace if she's still holding that notebook." Jessica explained that Brooke had filed complaints about Emma's toys being left in the front yard overnight, the family's inconsistent lawn maintenance schedule, and what she termed aesthetic violations that were allegedly affecting neighborhood property values. It was becoming clear that my mail situation wasn't isolated. Brooke was systematically targeting anyone whose lifestyle didn't match her narrow definition of acceptable suburban behavior. But Brooke's operation wasn't limited to observation and live streaming. She'd created what she called community safety awareness flyers and distributed them throughout the neighborhood. These weren't casual notes. They were professionally designed documents with official-looking graphics, urgent warnings about potential mail fraud schemes in residential areas, and detailed instructions for residents to recognize and report suspicious postal activity patterns. The flyers included photographs of my packages, a clear privacy violation, and encouraged neighbors to document unusual delivery schedules and report their observations to the HOA committee. The most bizarre escalation was when I discovered that Brooke had contacted the Postal Service directly to file what she called a suspicious activity report about my address. She'd claimed that the volume of mail I received indicated possible mail theft, package fraud, or identity harvesting operations. She'd also submitted formal complaints to the city about potential zoning violations and unauthorized commercial activity based on nothing more than her surveillance data and conspiracy theories about suburban crime patterns. Kevin Marshall, to his credit, began questioning Brooks' methods when she suggested they should install a small drone to monitor delivery trucks and track where else they might be making suspicious stops. That's when I realized this wasn't about community safety anymore, Kevin told me privately. She was enjoying the drama and the attention more than actually protecting anyone. He approached me to apologize for initially supporting what he now understood was systematic harassment rather than legitimate neighborhood watch activity. The situation reached a new level of absurdity when I received my first official HOA correspondence, a formal letter requesting detailed documentation about my home-based business operations and proof of compliance with residential zoning restrictions. The letter, clearly influenced by Brooks' pressure campaign, mentioned that multiple community members had raised concerns about commercial mail volume, and that the HOA was legally obligated to investigate potential covenant violations. Greg Morgan, the HOA president, had obviously been manipulated into taking official action despite his clear discomfort with the situation. This was when I shifted from annoyed resident to full cybersecurity professional mode. I created a comprehensive digital documentation system, logging every interaction with Brooke, photographing her surveillance activities, and building timeline visualizations that clearly showed the escalation from curiosity to stalking to organized harassment. I researched HOA bylaws, local privacy laws, and zoning regulations to understand exactly what rights I had and what legal boundaries Brooke was systematically violating with her surveillance campaign. While I was building my defense documentation, Brooke was escalating her social media presence beyond the neighborhood group. She'd started posting on community forums and local discussion boards about mail fraud, warning signs, and protecting suburban communities from suspicious residents. Her posts included detailed theories about how criminals might use residential addresses for illegal operations, photographs of my mail and packages, and instructions for other communities to implement similar monitoring programs to identify potential threats. Jessica Torres had become an unexpected ally in this increasingly surreal conflict. After witnessing Brooks' LED scoreboard spectacle and realizing that the harassment extended beyond my situation, Jessica began documenting her own experiences with Brooks' complaints and sharing information about the scope of the surveillance operation. She asked me to keep a log of your work schedule and report any visitors or unusual activity, Jessica revealed. She wanted me to note what time your lights went on and off, when you got deliveries, and whether you had any overnight guests. The breaking point came when I discovered that Brooke had been attempting to access the HOA's internal communications and resident database. Using network monitoring tools, I found evidence of multiple failed logging attempts from her IP address, trying to gain unauthorized access to private homeowner information, financial records, and confidential HOA discussions. She wasn't just harassing individual residents. She was trying to infiltrate the community's administrative systems to gather intelligence for her expanding campaign against anyone she deemed suspicious. By the end of that second week, Brooks' LED scoreboard had become a neighborhood attraction that was drawing visitors from other communities who wanted to see the mail counting house. People were taking photos and sharing videos of her surveillance setup on social media platforms throughout the region, turning our quiet suburban street into a minor tourist destination for people interested in bizarre HOA drama. What had started as harassment targeting me had evolved into a public spectacle that was affecting property values and making everyone in the neighborhood uncomfortable. I realized that treating this like a standard cybersecurity threat assessment was the right approach, but I needed to understand that Brooks' obsession with controlling and monitoring her neighbors was much more systematic and potentially dangerous than typical neighborhood disputes. She had the persistence of a professional investigator, the paranoia of a conspiracy theorist, and the technological resources to make life miserable for anyone who didn't conform to her expectations of normal residential behavior. The pounding on my door started at exactly 6 a.m. on a Thursday morning, the kind of aggressive knocking that immediately tells you this isn't a friendly neighbor visit or a package delivery. I stumbled out of bed, threw on clothes, and opened the door to find Detective Claire Bennett standing there with two uniformed officers, all of them looking like they were prepared for a serious criminal investigation rather than a neighborhood dispute. Behind them, I could see Brooke, standing in her front yard with her phone held high, clearly live streaming the entire scene with what appeared to be barely contained excitement. Miles Dalton, I'm Detective Bennett with the County Sheriff's Office. We need to discuss some serious allegations that have been made regarding mail fraud operations at this address. Her tone was professional but stern, and the presence of backup officers made it clear this wasn't a casual inquiry. As she spoke, I could see neighbors emerging from their houses, some in bathrobes and pajamas, drawn by the commotion of police cars in our quiet suburban street. Several people were openly filming the scene with their phones, and I realized this was exactly the kind of public spectacle that Brooke had been hoping to create. Detective Bennett explained that someone had filed detailed criminal complaints alleging that I was operating a mail fraud scheme, using my residential address to receive stolen mail, process fraudulent documents, and coordinate identity theft operations. The complainant had provided what she described as extensive documentation of my mail delivery patterns, photographs of packages, detailed theories about criminal operations, and claims that I had been evasive and uncooperative when questioned about my business activities by concerned community members. While the detective was explaining the allegations, I watched Brooke conducting what appeared to be live commentary for her social media audience. She was standing just close enough to be in the background of any photos or videos being taken, gesturing toward my house and clearly narrating the police investigation as validation of her months-long surveillance campaign. Her LED scoreboard had been updated with new text that read, "Investigation in progress," with flashing red lights, creating exactly the kind of dramatic visual that would make compelling content for anyone documenting the scene. The investigation itself was thorough and invasive. Detective Bennett required complete documentation of my business operations, tax returns, client contracts, professional licenses, security clearance verification, and detailed explanations of every aspect of my cybersecurity work. She interviewed me extensively about my daily routine, my professional relationships, and the specific types of materials I regularly received through mail delivery. 2 officers conducted a walkthrough of my home office, photographing my computer equipment, examining my filing systems, and documenting anything that might be relevant to the fraud allegations. But the most humiliating aspect was the public nature of the investigation. While police were inside my house, the HOA had arranged for a bright red notice to be posted on my front door, announcing that I was under investigation for violation of community standards and potential criminal activity. The notice was designed to be visible from the street and included language encouraging other residents to report any additional suspicious observations to authorities. It was essentially a public shaming device that marked my home as somehow dangerous or problematic. The neighborhood's reaction was immediate and polarizing. Some residents gathered in small groups, clearly gossiping about what kind of criminal activity might have been happening right under their noses. Others approached Detective Bennett directly, offering their own observations about my mail delivery patterns and expressing concern about property values and community safety. Jessica Torres stood in her front yard with her arms crossed, clearly frustrated by the spectacle, while Agnes Riley shook her head disapprovingly at the crowds of people treating this like entertainment rather than a serious investigation. What made the situation even more surreal was Brooke's social media commentary throughout the process. She was providing live updates about the investigation, speculating about what police might find, and encouraging her followers to share the stream to spread awareness about mail fraud schemes in suburban communities. Her posts were using hashtags like neighborhood safety and mail fraud alert, and she was clearly enjoying the attention and validation that came from having law enforcement take her complaints seriously. Detective Bennett spent over 3 hours reviewing my documentation, contacting my professional references, and verifying my business credentials with various agencies and certification boards. She was thorough but fair, asking pointed questions about my work while also noting, off the record, that the complaint showed signs of obsessive documentation that raised its own concerns about the complainant's motivations and mental state. When she contacted my security clearance office, they confirmed not only my legitimate status, but also expressed surprise that anyone would question the credentials of someone who had been thoroughly vetted by federal authorities. The investigation concluded with complete vindication. Detective Bennett found absolutely no evidence of illegal activity and noted that my business operations were not only legitimate, but also important for national cybersecurity efforts. However, she took time to warn me about harassment laws and the potential for filing counter-complaints if Brooke's behavior continued to escalate. She also mentioned that filing false police reports was a serious crime that carried significant penalties, including potential jail time and mandatory restitution for investigation costs. As the police cars were leaving, I watched Brooke's demeanor shift from excited anticipation to obvious disappointment. Her livestream audience was asking questions about why no arrests were being made, and she was scrambling to explain why the investigation hadn't resulted in the dramatic criminal bust she'd been promising. But instead of backing down, she seemed to interpret the lack of charges as evidence that authorities needed more information, and she was already talking about additional evidence gathering and expanded surveillance operations. That evening, I found the red investigation notice had been vandalized with additional text that wasn't part of the official HOA posting. Someone had added handwritten warnings about mail fraud operations and community threat assessment, clearly trying to escalate the public shaming beyond what even the HOA had authorized. I had security camera footage of Brooke approaching my door after the police left, but the vandalism had occurred during a period when she had alibis from neighbors who could verify her location. The most disturbing realization was that having the police completely clear me of wrongdoing hadn't ended Brooke's campaign. It had only made her more desperate to find something, anything, that would validate months of surveillance and harassment. She had crossed every line regarding privacy and basic civility, involving law enforcement in her personal vendetta and creating a public spectacle that had turned our quiet neighborhood into a source of community-wide conflict and drama. She had just demonstrated that she was willing to weaponize the criminal justice system to attack a neighbor whose only crime was receiving business mail at his home address. Now I was going to show her what happens when you target someone with advanced analytical skills and absolutely nothing left to lose. The gloves were officially off. Brooke had escalated our dispute to criminal allegations, involved law enforcement, and attempted to destroy my reputation based on nothing but her own paranoid theories. It was time to stop playing defense and start conducting what I like to call offensive threat intelligence, using the same techniques I employ to track cybercriminals, except this time my target was a suburban neighborhood Karen who had no idea she was about to face someone with professional-grade investigation skills and unlimited patience for detailed research. I began with comprehensive digital forensics, starting with social media analysis and public records searches. What I discovered was even more disturbing than I'd expected. Brooke hadn't just been harassing me, she'd been conducting systematic campaigns against residents in multiple communities over the past several years. Using advanced search techniques and cross-referencing IP addresses, I discovered that she'd been creating anonymous accounts on various community forums and complaint websites to file false reports against neighbors who didn't meet her standards of normal residential behavior. The pattern was remarkable in its consistency and disturbing in its scope. In her previous neighborhood, she'd filed anonymous complaints against a home-based bakery owner, accusing them of commercial zoning violations and food safety concerns. She'd reported a freelance graphic designer for excessive package deliveries and suspicious business activities. Most troubling was her campaign against a retired teacher who'd been investigated for potential mail fraud based on her reports about unusual correspondence patterns, essentially the same playbook she was using against me. But the real breakthrough came when I traced the IP addresses of recent anonymous complaints filed against various residents in our current neighborhood. Using network analysis tools and cross-referencing timestamps with known events, I discovered that Brooke had been filing complaints against at least 6 different households using fake names and email addresses. She'd reported Agnes Riley for suspected prescription drug distribution because of her regular pharmacy deliveries. She'd accused Kevin Marshall of possible insurance fraud activities before recruiting him as her surveillance partner. Most shocking was her anonymous report claiming that Jessica Torres was potentially neglecting her child based on observing Emma playing outside unsupervised. This was when I decided to create what I privately called my HOA Transparency Dashboard, a comprehensive digital monitoring system that would track all HOA communications, complaint filings, and decision-making processes in real time. Using publicly available information and freedom of information requests, I built a database that could identify patterns in complaint submissions, track resolution times, and analyze voting patterns among board members. It was designed to look like a standard community information portal, but it was actually a sophisticated data analysis tool that would expose any irregular or discriminatory enforcement activities. The dashboard revealed something that even I hadn't expected. Greg Morgan and other board members were being systematically manipulated by a flood of anonymous complaints that all traced back to Brooke's various fake accounts. She'd been creating the impression of widespread community concern about multiple residents, when in reality, it was just one person with an obsessive need to control her neighbor's behavior. The board was making decisions based on what they believed was genuine community input, not realizing they were being fed manufactured outrage by a single individual. My technical investigation also uncovered evidence that Brooke had been attempting to hack into the HOA's email system and resident directory. Log files showed multiple failed login attempts from her IP address using common password combinations and social engineering techniques. She'd been trying to access private homeowner information, financial records, and internal HOA communications, behavior that crossed the line from harassment into potential cybercrime territory. But the most damaging discovery was a series of fabricated documents that Brooke had been preparing to present as evidence against me and other residents. Using metadata analysis and document forensics, I found that she'd been creating fake correspondence, altered photographs, and falsified timestamps to build what she believed would be a compelling case against her targets. The documents were sophisticated enough to fool casual examination, but they contained digital fingerprints that clearly proved they'd been manufactured rather than genuine evidence of wrongdoing. Jessica Torres had become a crucial ally during this investigation phase, providing information about Brooke's attempts to recruit other residents as informants and surveillance partners. Jessica revealed that Brooke had been offering to help with various neighborhood issues in exchange for residents reporting suspicious activities they observed at targeted houses. She'd been building a network of unwitting accomplices who thought they were participating in legitimate community safety initiatives. Kevin Marshall's complete transformation from Brooke's deputy to my primary source of inside information proved invaluable during this period. He provided detailed accounts of Brooke's planning sessions, her theories about various residents, and her increasingly desperate strategies for maintaining credibility after the police investigation had cleared me of wrongdoing. Kevin revealed that Brooke had been talking about expanding the investigation to include other government agencies and potentially filing civil lawsuits against residents she couldn't eliminate through HOA enforcement. The psychological profile I was developing painted a picture of someone whose past trauma had evolved into a sophisticated harassment operation that used technology, bureaucracy, and social manipulation to terrorize anyone who didn't conform to her expectations. But what made Brooke particularly dangerous was her ability to present herself as a concerned community member while systematically destroying her neighbors' peace and privacy through calculated campaigns of false accusations and manufactured evidence. Armed with comprehensive documentation of her harassment patterns, evidence of her fake complaint submissions, and proof of her attempts to access private HOA information, I was ready to present a case that would not only clear my name but expose the full scope of her operations. The HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, and I intended to use it as the venue for what cybersecurity professionals call threat actor attribution, publicly identifying and documenting exactly who had been responsible for the community's recent problems. I had been building this investigation like a criminal prosecution, methodically gathering evidence and preparing for a presentation that would demonstrate not only my innocence, but also the systematic nature of Brooke's harassment campaign. But I hadn't anticipated that she would attempt one final desperate gambit that would backfire so spectacularly that it would become the definitive proof of everything I'd been documenting. The community meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock on Thursday evening, but the clubhouse was already packed by 6:30, with what looked like the largest HOA gathering in the neighborhood's history. Word had spread about the ongoing dispute, and residents were genuinely curious to see how this dramatic conflict would be resolved. What I hadn't expected was the presence of Miranda Kelly, a local blogger who specialized in HOA disputes and suburban governance issues, complete with professional live streaming equipment that would broadcast our neighborhood drama to her several thousand followers across the region. Brooke had clearly prepared for this meeting like it was her moment of ultimate vindication. She arrived with multiple binders, a laptop computer, and what appeared to be a prepared presentation that she'd titled Protecting Meadowbrook Heights, a Community Safety Case Study. She had also brought Kevin Marshall as her key witness, apparently unaware that he'd been secretly cooperating with my investigation for weeks and providing detailed information about her harassment tactics and falsified evidence. Greg Morgan struggled to maintain order as residents filled every available seat and lined the walls of the clubhouse. The formal agenda listed the item as discussion of resident compliance issues and community standards, but everyone knew this was really about whether the neighborhood would continue to tolerate Brooke's systematic harassment of residents whose behavior didn't meet her narrow definition of acceptable suburban living. When Greg called the meeting to order and introduced the agenda item, Brooke immediately requested permission to present what she called crucial evidence of ongoing criminal activity that threatens our community's safety and property values. She stood up with obvious confidence and began what can only be described as a prosecutorial presentation, complete with slides, charts, and detailed documentation of her months-long surveillance campaign against me and several other residents. But then came her critical mistake. Brooke announced that she had obtained confidential correspondence that would prove my involvement in fraudulent activities. She dramatically produced what she claimed were copies of incriminating emails and business documents that had been provided by concerned community members who had access to this evidence. As she began reading from these documents, describing their contents as proof of mail fraud and identity theft operations, I could barely contain my satisfaction at what was about to happen. I calmly stood up and requested permission to respond to these allegations using my own presentation. "I appreciate Mrs. Ellison's thorough documentation," I said, connecting my laptop to the projector system, "and I think the community will find my technical analysis of her evidence quite illuminating." The first slide of my presentation was titled, "Digital Forensics: How to Identify Manufactured Evidence," and I could see Brooke's confident expression beginning to shift toward concern as she realized I wasn't responding defensively. My presentation methodically dismantled every piece of evidence Brooke had presented, using metadata analysis to demonstrate that her supposedly confidential documents had been created on her own computer just 2 days earlier. The projection screen showed timestamps, IP addresses, and digital fingerprints that proved beyond any doubt that she had fabricated the incriminating correspondence and then tried to present it as genuine evidence obtained from external sources. But the most devastating moment came when I displayed security camera footage showing Brooke in her own home office, using photo editing software to alter images of my packages and create fake mailing labels with suspicious return addresses. The footage included timestamps and clear views of her computer screen as she manufactured the evidence she'd planned to use against me. The clubhouse erupted in gasps and murmurs as residents realized they were watching someone actively committing the kind of fraud she'd been accusing others of perpetrating. The audience's reaction shifted from shock to laughter when I displayed a side-by-side comparison of Brooke's LED scoreboard messages and her anonymous complaint submissions, showing that the timing and language were identical, down to specific phrases and typos. One resident actually laughed out loud when the presentation showed that she'd been copy-pasting text between her public displays and her fake complaint letters, creating a digital paper trail that definitively connected her to months of anonymous harassment. Miranda Kelly's livestream audience was growing rapidly as word spread about the dramatic confrontation unfolding in our suburban clubhouse. The chat comments were flowing faster than anyone could read, with viewers expressing amazement at the sophisticated technical presentation and the depth of evidence being revealed. Several viewers were sharing the stream on other platforms, turning our neighborhood meeting into viral content about HOA drama and digital detective work. Jessica Torres stood up to provide testimony about her own experiences with Brooke's harassment, describing the fake complaints about child neglect and the attempts to recruit neighbors as surveillance partners. Agnes Riley shocked everyone by revealing that Brooke had approached her with theories about prescription drug distribution and had actually tried to convince her to search through other residents' mail for suspicious pharmaceuticals. Kevin Marshall publicly apologized for initially supporting Brooke's campaign and provided detailed accounts of her planning sessions and her increasingly desperate strategies. As the evidence mounted, Brooke's demeanor shifted from confident prosecutor to desperate defendant. She accused me of being a professional manipulator who had somehow fabricated the digital evidence and convinced other residents to lie on my behalf. She claimed that the timestamps and metadata could be easily falsified by someone with my technical skills, not realizing that her argument was essentially admitting that she understood how digital evidence could be manufactured, knowledge that supported rather than undermined my case against her. The most damaging testimony came when Miranda Kelly announced that several viewers of her live stream had recognized Brooke from her activities in previous communities and were providing real-time information about similar harassment campaigns she'd conducted elsewhere. The chat was filling with accounts from former neighbors describing identical patterns of surveillance, false accusations, and manufactured evidence, creating a documented history of her behavior that extended far beyond our community. The community vote was unanimous. Residents formally censured Brooke's conduct, established new policies prohibiting harassment and unauthorized surveillance of neighbors, and passed a resolution supporting residents' rights to receive mail and conduct legitimate business activities without interference. But more importantly, The meeting had provided definitive proof that Brooks' entire campaign was based on fabricated evidence and systematic deception, rather than genuine community concerns. As residents were filing out of the clubhouse, discussing the dramatic revelations they had witnessed, Brooke approached me with an expression that was equal parts fury and desperation. "This isn't over," she said quietly, her voice shaking with barely controlled anger. "I know what you really are, and I'm going to prove it no matter what it takes." Her threat was clear, but after what had just been exposed about her methods and motivations, it was also obviously the promise of someone who had lost all credibility and was facing the possibility of serious legal consequences for her harassment campaign. I thought that public vindication and comprehensive exposure of her deception would finally end our neighborhood conflict. I should have realized that someone capable of systematic fraud and harassment wouldn't simply accept defeat and disappear quietly into suburban anonymity. Within 48 hours of the community meeting, Brooke launched what can only be described as a scorched earth campaign designed to destroy my reputation and validate her conspiracy theories at any cost. I received legal papers on Saturday morning, a defamation lawsuit claiming that my presentation at the HOA meeting had damaged her reputation and caused her emotional distress and professional harm. The lawsuit demanded $50,000 in damages and included a restraining order request that would have prevented me from discussing her behavior with other neighbors. It was clearly a desperate attempt to silence me and intimidate others who might consider speaking out against her harassment tactics. The legal papers were filled with wild theories and inaccurate claims that read more like the manifesto of someone having a psychological breakdown than legitimate legal documentation. She accused me of orchestrating a conspiracy between multiple neighbors to discredit her character and hide my criminal activities. She claimed that my cybersecurity work was a cover for illegal hacking operations and that my business correspondence was actually evidence of identity theft and mail fraud schemes. Most disturbing was her assertion that I was somehow manipulating other residents through psychological manipulation techniques learned through my work in security. But the lawsuit was just the beginning of her escalation. Brooke began what I can only call a harassment campaign designed to destroy my professional life. She submitted anonymous complaints to my employer, claiming that I was using company resources for illegal activities and that my security clearance should be revoked due to credible reports of criminal behavior. She contacted the certification boards that oversee cybersecurity professionals, making false claims about my professional conduct and demanding investigations into my credentials. She even attempted to reach my clients directly, sending emails that barely disguised her accusations as security verification requests. The psychological toll was significant. I was spending more time defending myself against false accusations than doing my actual job. Every phone call could be another complaint she'd filed. Every email might be from a client who'd been contacted by her. Every knock on the door could be another legal process server. Sleep became difficult as I found myself constantly alert for the next crisis she might create. This was exactly the kind of sustained harassment campaign designed to make someone's life so miserable that they would simply give up and move away. During this period, I learned more about Brooke's psychological state through an unexpected source, her sister Diane Ellison, who contacted me after hearing about the lawsuit from other family members. Diane explained that Brooke's behavior had been escalating for months, that the family was concerned about her mental health, and that the mail fraud scam she'd experienced years earlier had triggered what appeared to be an untreated anxiety disorder that manifested as paranoid suspicion of anyone whose behavior seemed unusual to her. Diane's revelations provided crucial context for understanding Brooke's motivations. She wasn't just a malicious neighbor trying to cause trouble, she was someone whose trauma response had evolved into a pathological need for control and validation. The scam that had cost her $15,000 had also cost her sense of security and ability to trust normal social interactions. Unfortunately, instead of seeking professional help to process her trauma, she'd become convinced that she could protect herself by identifying and eliminating potential threats in her environment, even when those threats were actually innocent neighbors living normal lives. But understanding Brooke's psychological state didn't make her behavior any less dangerous or destructive. Her anonymous complaints were causing problems with my security clearance review, forcing me to spend time and money on legal representation to address her false allegations. Her attempts to contact my clients were potentially damaging important business relationships that had taken years to build. Her social media campaign was creating a toxic atmosphere in the neighborhood that was affecting property values and community cohesion. The tipping point came when I discovered that Brooke had been conducting what could only be described as surveillance of my home during late evening hours. My security cameras captured her walking slowly past my house multiple times after dark, sometimes stopping to photograph windows or peer into my driveway. On one occasion, she was recorded using what appeared to be binoculars to observe my home office from across the street. This behavior crossed the line from harassment into potential stalking, and I realized that her desperation was making her increasingly unpredictable and potentially dangerous. Jessica Torres organized a support network among neighbors who were concerned about the toxic atmosphere Brooke was creating, but several residents were also pressuring me to just settle the lawsuit to make the drama go away. They were tired of the ongoing conflict and wanted their peaceful neighborhood restored, even if that meant rewarding Brooke's harassment tactics with a financial settlement. I understood their perspective, but I also knew that giving in to her demands would only encourage her to target other residents who didn't conform to her expectations of normal behavior. The decision I faced was whether to continue fighting and risk further escalation, or to settle and hope she would leave me alone. But as I reviewed the evidence of her behavior pattern over the past several months, I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. Brooke's harassment tactics were affecting the entire community, creating an atmosphere of fear and surveillance that was fundamentally changing the character of our neighborhood. Someone had to take a stand, not just for their own rights, but for the principle that neighbors shouldn't have to live in fear of false accusations and invasion of privacy. I realized this wasn't just about winning anymore. She needed help, but the entire community needed protection. Sometimes you have to be cruel to be kind, and I was about to demonstrate exactly what that meant. The comprehensive resolution I implemented was like conducting a coordinated cybersecurity response to a major threat, systematic, thorough, and designed to eliminate the problem permanently while minimizing collateral damage. I worked with my attorney to file a motion to dismiss Brooke's frivolous lawsuit, complete with a request for sanctions and attorney fees. Simultaneously, I compiled a comprehensive harassment documentation package for law enforcement, detailing her pattern of false accusations, privacy violations, and potential stalking behavior. But the most important element of my strategy was coordinating with Diane Ellison to ensure that Brooke received the professional help she clearly needed. The legal resolution came first. My attorney demonstrated that Brooke's lawsuit was not only without merit, but also potentially an abuse of the legal system, designed to silence legitimate criticism of her harassment tactics. The judge dismissed her case with prejudice, meaning she could never refile the same claims, and ordered her to pay my attorney fees and court costs. The sanctions were significant enough to make filing frivolous lawsuits an expensive proposition for anyone considering similar tactics in the future. But more importantly, Diane had convinced Brooke to accept responsibility for her behavior and agree to seek professional counseling in exchange for my agreement not to pursue all possible legal remedies against her. This wasn't about punishment. It was about getting someone the help they needed while protecting the community from further harassment. Brooke agreed to resign from all HOA positions, participate in a structured counseling program with progress reporting, and maintain no contact with residents she had previously targeted. The community transformation that followed was remarkable. The HOA implemented new bylaws specifically designed to prevent harassment and protect residents' privacy rights. Jessica Torres was elected to the HOA board, bringing a perspective focused on supporting families rather than policing normal residential activities. Clear complaint procedures were established with neutral arbitration requirements, making it much harder for future conflicts to escalate to the level of harassment we'd experienced. But the most surprising development was the arrival of Margaret Ellison, Brooke's mother, who appeared at my door one evening to apologize for her daughter's behavior and to discuss the possibility of positive change. Margaret had a professional background in conflict resolution and community mediation, and she'd been researching HOA reform for years. She explained that while Brooke's situation had been painful for the entire family, it had also provided a catalyst for implementing the kind of community governance reforms she'd been advocating. Margaret's proposal was intriguing. She wanted to work with me and other residents to create a model community governance system that could prevent future harassment while protecting legitimate community standards. Her expertise in conflict resolution, combined with my analytical skills and documentation of what had gone wrong, could potentially help other communities avoid similar problems. It was an opportunity to turn a negative experience into something that could benefit people far beyond our own neighborhood. My decision to create an online workshop called Digital Self-Defense Against HOA Harassment exceeded all my expectations. The The workshop shared techniques for documenting incidents, understanding legal rights, and building community support when facing unreasonable neighbors or HOA overreach. Within 3 months, over 500 families across the country had used the resources to address their own neighborhood conflicts, and I was receiving thank you messages from people who had successfully stood up to harassment in their communities. 6 months after the resolution, I received updates on everyone involved in our neighborhood drama. Brooke had moved to a smaller community near her family, where she was participating in ongoing therapy and reportedly making genuine progress in addressing her anxiety and trust issues. Diane sent occasional updates, indicating that, with proper professional support, Brooke was beginning to understand how her trauma response had affected her behavior and her relationships with others. Jessica Torres and her daughter Emma were thriving in the supportive community environment we'd created. Property values in the neighborhood had actually increased due to our positive reputation for resident rights and community cooperation. Agnes Riley mentioned that she felt safer and more comfortable in her own home, knowing that unreasonable harassment wouldn't be tolerated by other residents. The most gratifying outcome was receiving thank you letters from some of Brooke's previous victims in other communities. My documentation of her harassment pattern had provided them with the evidence they needed to address their own unresolved conflicts and find closure for problems they'd faced years earlier. It reinforced my belief that standing up to bullies isn't just about protecting yourself, it's about protecting everyone who might become their next target. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that the best way to handle a bully isn't just defeating them, it's fixing the system that enabled their behavior in the first place. When you build something better together, everyone wins, including the bullies who eventually get the help they need. My mail still comes every day, sometimes even more than before as my consulting business has grown, but nobody counts the pieces anymore. Well, except me, but that's just professional habit. It turns out that when you create a community based on mutual respect instead of surveillance and suspicion, everyone can focus on living their lives instead of policing their neighbors.